I'd like to start by offering you a luscious blackcurrant. Those of you who've got blackcurrant bushes in your gardens, they're almost there. So get into the swing of local, seasonal, fresh. And I'm going to cover, hopefully quickly in my 10 minutes, these 3 points. So again, looking back at the UK food carbon contribution, the various views on that, looking at what a sustainable local food economy is about, and then how we can start to make changes for that in Bristol and some of the things that are already going on. And we've seen over the last decade a huge transformation for the local food sector, the local food movement in the UK. All of you will be familiar with farmers markets, and here's the one in Bristol. And that has really shifted consciousness and interest, I think, in the issues. We need to look in that bigger context at the food carbon contribution. It's widely agreed that the food chain's contribution is around 20%. A new report has just come out from the WWF and the FCRN about how long can we go looking at emissions, and they're suggesting that it's nearer to 30 because of changes in land use if you put land into crop production, take trees off, etc. So if the country is going to be committed to its emissions reductions, the authors of this report suggest that the food industry needs to work really hard and bring those emissions down by 70%. And there's been further work. There's all sorts of carbon footprinting models out there. There's been a very interesting one developed at the University of Manchester, CCalc, some of you may have come across it, and it's developed for industry as a whole, not just the food sector. And one of their case studies that I found was looking at supermarket lamb curry. They reckon that the footprint is equal to 140 million car miles. And what's interesting about this case study is that they found that the biggest bit is not actually transport, you know, we've talked about food miles, etc., but actually it's in the production and the processing much more, and often in the very raw material and the way that first lot of ingredients have been produced. And this case study is very interesting because they suggest that that refrigeration stage is also a key bit, so actually home processing makes a lot more sense. So here we are, production and processing, big responsibilities, and how are we going to deal with that? We know that there's been a lot of discussion about meat production, livestock, we heard that earlier, and there have been other studies looking at different types of livestock production. We've heard a bit earlier again that more extensive production of animals with natural forage on grass, keeping that ground covered, permanent pasture, that's all very important. It's also important for the ways the animals are reared, and it requires having less animals on the land. And we know that poultry and pig production globally are probably the biggest culprits on emissions because of the intensive systems that are used. You might have come across the Soil Association's Soil Carbon Report, which was published last year. Within the natural cycle, of course, carbon is naturally sequestered through biological processes around roots in crops. So it's a natural process and achievable, and the Soil Association's research looked at changing all of UK's farming to organic and what the impact of that would be. So there you go, 1 million cars off the road. But the point being, keeping more permanent pasture, putting animals on more grassland, and building that soil carbon within the actual process, the rotation systems, the way that you work with fertilisers, natural fertilisers, manures, etc. I've put this picture in because I started by saying that we need food systems that really serve the community. And here, if you look at the way the food system operates, of course all the decisions are made around efficiency, economics, but all of those decisions are made for each of those separate components. So we've got intensive industrialised production instead of much more low carbon, responsible, organic, agroecological. We've got distribution and marketing, which is global. It's huge amounts of transport, even though at the moment perhaps that's less of our concern, but transport nevertheless is there, which doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when we're net exporting and then importing often the same products. We've got consumption, which is being dictated to us by the supermarkets, apparently have a lot of choice, but actually there's a whole school of thinking about the choice editing that goes on if you follow Professor Tim Lang. That's a very interesting thing to follow up there, on actually our choices aren't as free as we think they are. And looking at a different way at consuming, buying in bulk together, community-supported agriculture type links, supporting specific farms, supporting local markets. That's a different way of doing that. And then, of course, the waste disposal is a big part of this picture. And not landfilling, but recycling those nutrients that come, or redistributing our huge amount of food waste, which is often just going into landfill, which is perfectly edible. Here's the Stroud Community Supported Agriculture Group that got a mention earlier. Group of people renting land and growing food together for themselves. So if we want to cut down our carbon footprint, it's seasonal, local, fresh. Quote from Barney here in Bristol. We can produce so much more, probably staples and fresh produce closer to cities than is currently happening, but of course that requires a big shift in our thinking, our planning of land use and the relationship between cities and farms in the hinterland. So that's our challenge. And maybe some of these principles I put in here are wider than just thinking about carbon. You know, a food economy is much more than just carbon. And these are some of the principles that have helped to shape work going on in the last decade in the UK on building more sustainable food systems. And when people get together and are clear about what the fundamental underlying principles are, then things can begin to shift much more quickly. We've seen a huge change in public procurement, change in school meals, again using more fresh seasonal produce. The Food for Life partnership, which is led by the Soil Association working with other organisations, is a great example of that. We've seen much more support of artisan businesses. Here we've had a mention of trees and crops together. So opportunities for change in Bristol. Perhaps we could look at more soil management approaches with help from the Agricultural College around the city, around the hinterland, sequestering more carbon. More trees in the food system, pocket orchards all around the city, doing the same thing and producing food. Cooking from scratch, that's a big one. We can produce all these staples, but if people don't know how to cook, we've got a problem. That's part of a resilient system. Thinking carefully about how land is developed, how land is allocated, both within and around the city, that's a big challenge for our decision makers and policy makers. Really working to support these shorter supply chains and creating markets for producers who otherwise really struggle to get their products here, and building a stronger, resilient food economy. In my final 15 seconds, there's an awful lot going on in Bristol. It's actually very, very exciting. I'm involved with mapping the food system at the moment, looking at who feeds Bristol, and leading that work will lead towards developing a resilient food plan along the lines we've been talking today. The voluntary sector, the Bristol Food Network, have developed their own food strategy and they're working together to try and take that forward. They have a vision of a Bristol food garden city, getting everybody in the city to think about producing food in some way. We have a food charter jointly between the council and the NHS, a very strong food network and a monthly newsletter that goes out. So if those of you that aren't signed up, do sign up. It's where you find all the information for this particular area of activity. And of course we've got restaurants, caterers, people that are trying to support local producers and source local products. And finally this resilient food plan, which will be a big challenge. We need a lot of heads around the table on that one because this is complicated. So do have a strawberry to end.